Hi, everyone. I think we've got people who are joining us. Fantastic. We just will wait a moment or two as people join. And today, so hi, everyone. We'll do a bit of an introduction while we're waiting. You may know I'm Dr. Sophie Scamps. And we thought we would have a bit of a session today because we have legislation coming up in front of the House sometime soon that is all about scams. What are we going to do about scams? Because each of us probably knows someone who's been scammed, and it can be absolutely devastating, not just financially, but for an individual's mental health and their family stress and their family's mental health. So we thought we would have a discussion about where is Australia up to in preventing scams? How do we compare to other countries? And we are really, I think, privileged today to have with us Stephanie Tonkin, who is the CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre. So I'm going to give Stephanie a bit of an introduction before we get started. So the Consumer Action Law Centre, it is a prominent advocacy organisation in Australia that aims to empower consumers through legal support and policy reform. It engages in research, advocacy and education to address systemic issues affecting consumers, particularly those in disadvantaged positions. The Centre works on a range of issues, including consumer rights protections, striving to create a fairer marketplace for all Australians. So we're very lucky to have Stephanie, who is the CEO of Consumer Action Law Centre. And as a way of an introduction to Stephanie, Stephanie has a strong background in public law with over a decade working in community legal and consumer sectors. One of her many areas of expertise is consumer vulnerability. And we're really all vulnerable these days, aren't we, with the online sphere that we work in. Stephanie is a strong advocate committed to enhancing consumer protections in Australia and is actively involved in various industry and government advisory committees, including the National Anti-Scam Centre Advisory Board and the ASIC Consumer Advisory Panel. We are very honoured to have you with us today, Stephanie, just to chat through what's happening. We know, I know at least, that we have draft legislation that is going to come in front of the House for debate, and we need to be able to make it as strong as possible so that we are protecting Australians. But also, I think people who are on the call today will also be really interested to know how they can protect themselves and their businesses from being scammed. And one of the statistics, or some of the statistics that I find particularly alarming, is that in Australia, and correct me if I'm wrong, but every 6 minutes, a business or a small business is scammed in Australia. And small businesses in particular are targeted because they don't have the big human resources and digital, support sectors. They're usually an individual or a family running a business, something like that. So they are susceptible and vulnerable to these scams. And on average can lose up to $46,000, and it's often really hard to get that money back. So this is a really topical issue. So thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really good. And I should say as well, before we kick into this, is that as an MP, as an independent MP, we often have a diverse range of legislation coming in front of us. And the way we often work is to work closely with people who are experts and organisations that are experts in the particular legislation. So that's why we engage with people like Stephanie from the Consumer Action Law Group on issues like this, which is really important that we get our eyes on it and we know we have that expertise backing up what the amendments that we bring in. So Stephanie, let's get started. I'll start simply. Can you explain to us what a scam is and how it potentially differs from other types of financial fraud?
Sure. So we've all received a text message, hi mum, hi dad. Maybe we've seen some curious emails in our inboxes, perhaps even phone calls, which don't sound quite right. A scam can originate in so many ways, and effectively it's someone trying to steal money from you. And I'm often asked, why isn't it dealt with like a crime? And it is a crime. It is literally a crime. But unfortunately, it's often a faceless criminal, and very often someone overseas in a jurisdiction we can't reach. and it's taking place on platforms here that we use here in Australia. So a scam, and it's distinct from a fraud, and I'll go through that and try and explain it simply. And it is really complex, this stuff as well. So a scam is deemed to be where you do authorize the transfer or the payment from your own bank account into someone else's bank account. And so sometimes it's called authorized push payment fraud. So you're saying, yes, do transfer this money from here into there. A fraud is a good example is where you drop your credit card and someone picks it up and uses it to make an online purchase, and you don't know about that until you get your statement. That's a fraud because you haven't authorized that payment technically. Now, in real life, when a scam happens, you may be authorizing a transaction, but you don't know you're paying it to a scammer. You're under misapprehension. Sometimes people are socially engineered over many, many years by a scammer. So there's not an element of awareness of that transaction, but it's dealt with separately at the moment by the law, and your chances of being reimbursed, your losses, really does fall on whether you authorize that payment, like a scam would be, or you didn't authorize it, which would fall into that fraud bucket.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the thing is that these scams and scammers, they're highly sophisticated. Often it is incredibly difficult to tell or to realize that you're being scammed. So to say that you've authorized something is kind of hard to swallow in many ways. But there is a big difference there, isn't there, between the reimbursement that you might get if you authorize something or whether it was a fraud. And I understand that the percentage of reimbursements for scams is incredibly low in Australia. Have you got some information on that?
Sure. So when it is a fraud, there's the e-payments code applies, and you are entitled to reimbursement in most circumstances. But for scams, ASIC has released 2 reports now, consecutive reports, one in 2023 and one in 2024, that show that the major banks are reimbursing just 2 to 5% of scams losses in this country. And that scams loss total is estimated to be more than $2.74 billion last year alone. So in 2023, $2.74 billion lost from Australians, and the banks reimbursing just 2 to 5% of that. So really, we're all paying for it. Business is paying for it. Individuals are paying for it. And then the government is paying for it because the people who come to consumer action, for example, have lost their life savings and all of a sudden don't have a buffer to afford their rent, may not be able to afford their mortgage anymore, or put food on the table. It can have quite harrowing and life-changing consequences for people who do fall victim to a scam.
So it sounds like it's incredibly difficult to get your money back when you've been scammed, and puts people in these really incredibly stressful and devastating situations. Do most people try and push through to get reimbursed, or do they just give up?
Oh, that's a great question. So at the moment, there's a fair absence of laws in this space, and we'll get to what the proposed laws are looking like at the moment. So right now, we kind of have to work in with that e-payments code I mentioned before, so trying to push as many circumstances into that framework that exists as possible. But most of them we do see decision makers determining that it was a scam and falls outside of those laws. And so we just rely on general principles. Should a bank have been on notice about a potential risk of fraud, and should they have protected the customer? Was there any way in which the bank has contributed to the loss? So the framework that a scam victim would follow is to initially go to their bank and say, I've been scammed, shut down my accounts, please. Don't let any more money be taken out if there's any more to lose, but also investigate and seeking repayment as well of the scam losses. And a bank will go and do that investigation. In almost every case that we see, the bank says, it's not our fault, it's your fault, take more care next time. and then the pathway from there. A lot of people do give up at that point. Sometimes, often we do hear of banks making goodwill gestures of a couple of $100, sometimes $1,000, but with a non-disclosure agreement, so a person can't pursue the claim anymore. So we hear of a little bit of that, a fair bit of that going on at that first stage. But if a victim declines that, then they'll go to the next stage, which is external dispute resolution. And that's the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, or AFCA. That's an ombuds scheme. And so that's free and independent. You can make your complaint there. Unfortunately, I heard just this morning of year-long delays there already in order to have your dispute heard and get a determination in your claim. And again, the vast majority of those cases, because we don't really have a clear framework, most of those cases are being determined in the bank's favour. Although we did have one good decision recently that talked about how sophisticated scammers are now and how they are expert manipulators. And in that case, it was a bit different because the AFCA determined the person didn't authorize the payment necessarily, but then they said it wasn't voluntary, whatever they did anyway. So because of that manipulation and control. So there was a good decision there. It took a long time to get there. But it is good that independent decision maker is thinking in that way.
Fantastic. Well, that's a positive step in Australia. So we'll dive down into where Australia is at the moment and where we're heading with this new legislation. But I thought I'd just maybe touch on briefly about how people and businesses are getting scammed. On what type of forums? Is it through emails, phone calls, online? What's the breakdown there?
Well, I'm sad to say that it's across everything. And so in the ACCC's most recent targeting scams report, they reported that text message was the key way that people are falling into scams. But unfortunately, these are very complex webs now. So a text message might lead into a link that takes you to a website where you hand over your credentials, and then it's a compromised bank account. So you've got three different sectors there: telco, digital platform, sometimes multiple digital platforms like a Google and then a Meta, and then you might even be directed into WhatsApp. And then ultimately the transaction always takes place from your bank account to another bank account, and less so, but often also crypto, and then it tends to wash out of the country and is untraceable. So that's the pathway. I don't know if that answered your question. I forgot.
Well, no.
Caught up in the web.
There's a lot of pathways, but I think the interesting piece that you said in there, that it's always between bank, a bank is always pretty much involved somewhere along the line. So we'll come back to that a bit later. But you mentioned a bit earlier the ASIC's report that was handed down in April 2023, which really looked into how Australia was performing in preventing these scams, in addressing it when people are scammed. And you mentioned that it was only 2 to 5%, a measly amount of people are being reimbursed, even though there's these really sophisticated scams. What else did it show? And I guess going from there, how have we gone since then? Have things moved on? Have things improved since we got that report in April last year?
So the report in April last year looked at the four majors, and it said major banks, sorry. And it said those banks had a very immature response to scams. I think only one of those banks had a governance strategy for scams. Like there was only one with a scam strategy. And when you've got in that previous year, you had $3 billion lost to scams. So when you've got that much money being lost for your customers on your platforms, it's extraordinary. Since then, there's been another report where ASIC looked at more of the mid-tier banks, but also checked back in on those majors. It found the The reimbursement rate, there was one bank that started to reimburse more, although I think that may have dropped off again now. So it was pretty steady at 2 to 5. It went up to 2.7 on account of this one bank doing something for a period of time. But there had been some progress in the banks lifting their socks up and taking some more preventative actions. Importantly, it did find, and this together with the ACCC's report published similar times, they did find that targeted investment in prevention strategies was reducing scams. So we saw that most of the scams a couple of years ago were most of the losses were into investment scams because they're high value, people clicking on links, people being tricked into investing in crypto. And so the banks, well, when I remember talking to the banks early last year, they were saying there's no way we can possibly add in friction. People will leave the bank or, be outraged if we slow down payments, and no way we can block payments to crypto. They then did those things and we saw a reduction. So we went from $3.2 billion lost in 2022. That reduced down to $2.74 billion in 2023. And really, it's those targeted investments by the banks in preventing scams that were making the difference now.
Great. So just in comparison, look, it does sound like Australia has not been doing particularly well. We're still losing $2.7 billion a year, which is a huge amount. Other countries are doing a lot more. I think we can have a chat about the UK, but other countries like Singapore and New Zealand have much stronger legislation than what Australia has. And so we'll move on to having a chat about the legislation. But I just wanted to do that little comparison. Australia at the moment loses $2.7 billion a year, which is $228 per capita. In comparison, the UK, which has been a lot stronger and a lot more proactive in trying to prevent and address scams, a much bigger population currently loses $870 million. So a year. So compare that $2.7 billion lost in Australia to $870 million in the UK with a bigger population. They lose $13 per capita a year. So it's quite a big difference. So I wanted to just have a chat to you first before we start to sort of go towards what the government is proposing with our new legislation. What is the UK, or what has the UK done or is currently doing that has made a difference? Because they're quite different, those numbers, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. It's very stark. So about 6 years ago, the UK introduced a voluntary reimbursement framework. So about 10 of the major banks over there agreed to a code of practice under which they would reimburse their customers' scam losses. And that has driven investment in those prevention measures that stop scams before they happen. And it's also led to banks responding quicker when they have a tip-off. There's much faster recovery and pulling back. There's friction in the system. Confirmation of pay is a really good example of this. So when you make a transfer from your bank to another bank, you think that when you type the name in, that name is also being checked against the BSB and account number, but it's not in Australia at the moment. There's some limited checking with Pay ID now, but on the whole, it's not really checking. And therefore, we see large amounts of money being lost through false billing scams and other scams, investment scams, etc. So in the UK, they also had that problem, but when the voluntary reimbursement code came online, the banks there invested very quickly in confirmation of payee technology, which has been online for years now in the UK and preventing lots of scams from taking place. So here, and so those laws were voluntary, but on the 7th of October, they became mandatory. So it's a whole different culture around scams over there in the UK, where the banks are seen as the ones needing to invest in protecting their customers. You put your money in a bank to keep it safe, and the bank is the platform on which the scam ultimately takes place. And they're the ones with access to the information. They're the ones also holding Mule accounts where the scam money is transferred into. So they're holding that account, and they're whether legitimately or not approving a person for to hold that bank account, or they're allowing that bank account to be then compromised by someone else. So the banking sector has been the focus of the UK, and we'll talk about Australia looking at a broader and I think potentially better system. But we've had those laws come online. They're mandatory now for all banks in the UK, and again, about driving the investment in prevention.
It sounds like Australia, the banks have sort of got off the hook, haven't they, in trying to, well, if you're not having to reimburse for these great losses, there's not a huge incentive or motivation to try and prevent them. So it seems like, I mean, it seems a no-brainer, doesn't it, that there should be this confirmation of payee technology. And if it's been available in other countries like the UK for many years now, why on earth is it not happening in Australia? And so just looking into why that has not yet happened is really important. We'll talk a little bit more, I think, later about what a Mule account is, what you mean by friction, and how easy or hard is it to have this confirmation of payee type thing. But let's talk about now. There is draft legislation that will eventually come in front of the House for debate. It's open for submissions and comment now. I would love your opinion on what it does do and what it doesn't do. What are its strengths and weaknesses, and can we make it any better?
Yeah, sure. Treasury government released the draft Scams Prevention Framework, which is draft legislation which government is hoping to pass through Parliament later this year, and to introduce some direct scams laws. And I've mentioned how we have a bit of an absence of those laws now. It's a different approach to elsewhere in the world. It sets up a very high-level framework that will be administered by the ACCC. And there's a whole lot of principles in that very high-level framework around having governance, preventing scams, disrupting scams, responding to scams, reporting scams. And it is very high level, I keep saying, and that's important because then we'll have codes of practice and rules as well, like regulations coming later on. What's proposed in these laws, there are some really good parts about it. It is focused in on prevention, which is good. That's what we need to do with the advent of AI, biometrics being stolen and used against us. Scams are near impossible for us to detect now. And so pushing that onus on industry is really important to protect and disrupt. They're the ones in the position to be able to see what's going on. And there's a big information sharing regime that's set up with these principles, which means that the banks, the telcos, and the digital platforms are all going to have access to live data about scams that are happening, about intel, about dodgy links, dodgy bank accounts, dodgy text messages, all those sorts of things. So there's going to be all this information swirling about, and those businesses from those three sectors, and they're the first ones to come online under this framework. So again, the banks, the telecommunications companies, and digital platforms like Meta and Google, and they'll be subject to these rules first. And so that's the big framework that will be set up. But then I think where the rubber hits the road for a scams victim or for consumers is that response principle, which we'll probably go into in a bit more detail. But that's really, if you've been scammed, what you do, where you can go.
Yeah, it seems when I hear about it spoken about, comparing what is proposed here in Australia to what is actually being done now, has been introduced in the UK. One, there's a big time lag here in Australia. It's not going to be introduced for a number of years still. So in the meantime, people will still be able to be scammed. But it seems like when you distill it down, the big difference is in Australia, we're going for prevention, fantastic, and penalties, but there's 2 tiers of penalties, which is a bit confusing.
Yeah.
Whereas in the UK, there's this real push for reimbursement. The customer who's been scammed gets reimbursed, and the aim is to do it within 5 days. We heard from you previously that it can take up to a year here in Australia to even be heard, and the likelihood of being reimbursed is incredibly low, might be 2%. So it's great that we will be moving towards prevention, but is that actually going to help us? Is that actually going to motivate the banks, particularly when there's this 2 tiers of penalty? Are the banks going to be penalised if they are found to be at fault for not preventing people from being scammed?
Yeah, there's so much in that. So in terms of the timing, the principles, we don't expect seeing them coming into force until 2027. And some of those codes and rules, they may not come online until 2028 because, government's saying the businesses need time to get their systems online. But, we've had scams just as long as other jurisdictions. So, the timing's concerning. But yes, this framework is focused on setting out a set of principles and obligations on industry to take action, but it kind of misses the point on the effectiveness of dispute resolution. So, as you say, dispute resolution is that response. It's where a victim goes to get help. And so that will likely be your bank still, but you could go to one of those other industries and then it'll knock over into external dispute resolution, kind of a similar process to what we've got now. The problem with the framework as it's set up, and it's not a total throw in the bin. It's good. It just, we can make some tweaks with it that I'll describe. The problem is that it's going to set up a minimum compliance regime where businesses will make sure they've met the minimum standard and tick a box and move on. And that doesn't keep with the times. It doesn't keep with scammers that are innovating every single day. They're well-resourced international criminal networks. A tick a box approach is not going to work. As well, there are high penalties for certain breaches of these principles and the codes. But again, one regulator isn't going to have capacity to police this. So again, this is missing the point of the role of dispute resolution. Dispute resolution is really where the obligations and the incentives come online for a framework like this. And this is all new law. This is a whole new system. So it's not easy to imagine and create. But at the same time, we've got an effective system happening over in the UK already that we can tweak and make better. The question has to be asked, why aren't we going down that path? So yes, reimbursement and making that system as simple as possible. And I do have a diagram, so let me know when you want me to diagram.
Let's whack it up.
Yeah, whack it up again. So, there's really 2 things about making sure we've got an effective dispute resolution system. It's not just, what's fair and having a person having a right to access justice and move on with their lives after falling victim to a scam. And again, these people I speak to, almost every week who've been fallen victim to a scam, this changes lives for the much worse. It's an absolute crisis in our country at the moment. So that's a really important component. But also, if the banks and the telcos and the platforms, if they're on the hook for paying for the scam losses for the billions of dollars, quick smart, they're going to invest in innovating and keeping up with what's needed to really prevent and disrupt scams in this country.
Stephanie, can I ask, what does SPF could lead?
Yes.
What does SPF mean?
Thank you. SPF is the Scams Prevention Framework. So that is what this is a chart that maps out what the proposed Scams Prevention Framework, the dispute resolution model, would likely kind of look like for a simple scam. And it compares it to what it could look like if you followed more of the UK approach with some tweaks to make it a bit better. So it's no one can probably read this, but it sets out, first of all, a really simple scam. Someone's fallen victim to a text message scam. And then you can see we've got stage one, if you're moving from the left across to the right. Stage one, under what's proposed in the laws, you'd have someone going to their sending bank, asking them to stop, asking them to investigate, asking them to try and get the money back. The bank, what we see now is the banks can take months to investigate just at that stage. And then it will knock over into internal dispute resolution, where a person could go to their bank, and they likely would go to their bank. That's where the money's gone from. That's who they have a relationship with. But they could also go to the digital platform, the telco involved, or the receiving bank as well. The framework sets up a system where consumers and small businesses can access can go to any of the businesses involved in the scam and try to get their money back. That's a good idea in theory, but in practicality, what I'm trying to display is how that's unworkable. If you do just go to your bank, you're going to be looking at a bank trying to sort it out between a receiving bank, a Meta who may or may not respond, a telco. If you're not happy with the outcome, which is highly likely from everyone I'm speaking to at the moment and the experts who work in the space, you're then going to try and get some advice. Advice services are few and far between. That's going to take a long time. And then ultimately going to external dispute resolution, this stage 4, where you've got a dispute not just with your bank, but it pulls in all the other businesses as well. So receiving bank, platform, telco, you're fighting individually with each of them, but also they're fighting between themselves about who should pay what. At the moment, we see we've got disputes that are, like I said, 12 plus months in AFCA. We've got some cases where in natural disaster cases against insurers, and we're still sorting out claims from the October 2022 floods. So you can see how when there's a bit of pressure in terms of volume, it can be devastating in terms of the ability to see a dispute through. So we're really concerned about the length of time this is going to take.
Yeah. It seems like when you look at this table, you can see how complicated the proposed kind of reimbursement scheme is, how complicated it is, and how it comes down to case by case, comes down to the individual trying to get their money back from the banks. So it's sort of like the individual fighting against the banks, fighting against the international platforms or the telcos to try and get reimbursed. And it can be so complicated and inconsistent. Whereas in the UK, it sounds the fallback position is that reimbursement happens. It happens within 5 days, and then the big companies and the banks and the telcos and the platforms fight it out almost amongst themselves. Is that right? As to who will pay for what proportion? Is that how it kind of works? And is that what the the Action Law Centre is calling for?
Yeah. So what you're describing is what we think would be the best solution. So in the UK, a consumer like this final ideal situation begins with, a consumer will go to their bank and say, I've been scammed. In the UK, it's just 5 business days for a bank to investigate and reimburse a consumer. And then they move on with their life. And then in the UK, the sending bank, who you're a customer of, will go to the receiving bank, who the transfer was made to, and they share liability 50-50. What we say is an even better and more incentivizing system would be if an Australian consumer goes to their bank, let's give them 10 business days. Let's be, realistic for the bank to then make an assessment, do any of the exclusions to reimbursement apply? Was there gross negligence on the part of the consumer? Same as in the UK. Was the consumer part of that fraud? Are they a criminal too? If not, reimburse. And then what we're proposing is that not only can the bank go to the receiving bank to share the liability, the bank can also go to the telco and the platform, but just not on the consumer's time. And this is where the framework's got it wrong. The burden of the system is on the shoulders of a scam victim. And scams victims we're speaking to are not up for the fight. It takes a lot of courage to keep on fighting against banks telling you that you're going to lose, receiving legal letters from big law firms, pages and pages. We've heard of 500 pages being served on people, even in the Financial Complaints Authority, with complex legal arguments, and scams victims who have lost their money having to engage lawyers to fight back, to try and get their life savings or their retirement dream back. So this system here puts the onus, yes, it puts the onus back on industry, like the rest of the framework does. But quick smart, we can have industry investing in preventions like the confirmation of payee, like not registering scam ads, like vetting the scam ads, like blocking those text messages. And we're going to have a much safer system. And that means that we're going to stop the scams, which means that the reimbursement bill at the end of the day and the harm from the whole big problem, the harm's going to go away. So it's just it's logical, and we've got a template. And this is a much fairer approach that's going to drive all of the objectives of this framework, which is to make Australia world leading in scams protection.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I'll just say at this moment, people are very welcome to ask a question. If you can put your question in the chat. Is it in the Q&A or in the chat? Sorry, I've got Lexi sitting here.
In the Q&A box.
In the Q&A box. You can put a question in the Q&A box, and I'll try and get those to Stephanie. And in the meantime, we'll keep chatting. We'll wait for some questions to come through. But it does sound like there's quite a bit we can do here with our legislation in Australia to make it fairer for consumers. But one of the arguments that banks or others use against this reimbursement model is the honeypot model. Like, well, scammers will just be flocking here, rubbing their hands in glee because, if people are getting reimbursed, then they'll continue making all these, bad decisions and losing money, and it'll become a honeypot and attract more scammers. What's your response to that? And what have we seen happen in the UK?
Well, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. I think that argument is quite ridiculous. We've got the proof in the pudding already. We've got, on any measure,
lost Stephanie
the
from
UK has had sorry?
So you froze for just a second. Sorry, but you're back.
Sorry.
So that's fantastic. You always hold your breath for a second. Sorry, keep going.
It has just told me my connection's unstable, so hopefully it's okay. So yeah, the argument is quite ridiculous. We've got far less losses to scams in the UK, which has had a reimbursement system on foot for 6 years. Far less on any measure is lost to scams over there than here in Australia. And if we have businesses investing in prevention measures, they're really slow to come online, some of the prevention measures. And we've got banks here that have put prevention measures online in their overseas, organisations, but they haven't put those same protections here. And we saw that play out very publicly in the HSBC scam that's received a lot of publicity recently, where that scam existed in the UK a few years prior, but those same protections didn't come online here until hundreds of people had fallen victim to a very similar scam. So if we're investing in stopping the scams, I mean, the businesses are the front line of the scams here. They're the ones that have the power, the resources, the data, access to the information. To put that all on the consumer to take care of themselves is quite ridiculous. So the honeypot argument, we are the honeypot right now. We are losing $2.74 billion. We have a small population compared to the rest of the world. And it's because it's been left to industry to kind of deal with it, and it hasn't been dealt with. And that's why we need really strong laws now.
Fantastic. I've got a question here, which says, it appears that the proposed legislation is overly complex, too slow to be initiated 2028, and does nothing to relieve the pain of the victims. So I guess just that you've gone into detail about that. What would the Consumer Action Law Centre be proposing? You're really talking about that reimbursement model, and how easy would that be to put that part of the legislation on what the current proposed legislation is?
Yeah, sure. So the scam prevention framework, the draft laws, have 6 principles, and 1 to 5 of those can stay. But the response principle, at the moment, it's drafted so that if a bank, a telco, a platform meets the rules set out in the law and in the codes, then the consumer has to pay. So flipping that burden onto to business, so that unless a person has exhibited gross negligence or is part of the scam, it's on the bank to reimburse the victim. And so that's defaulting to the bank. And again, that's going to be that incentive for the banks to therefore invest in preventing the scams in the first place. So the rest of the framework, there'll be a couple of tweaks for harmonisation, but the rest of the framework can stand. But it falls down at this response principle. Truly, it's going to be very expensive to run that kind of dispute resolution. And in my view, and from national advocates from across the country who are representing scams victims right now, we feel it's going to grind to a halt. Like, it will be unworkable, and we will have to revisit it, and we will have to change it. And we've got a good system that can really be world leading, because we can pull in those other industries as well. And that's just flipping that presumption in the response principle. So the legislation can go through with an amendment.
Fantastic. So this is why I love working with expert groups. They work so deeply and know the law so well. So it's part of this is to show people in my electorate as well how we work and where we how we consult with the experts as well on legislation like this. But it does sound like with this current piece of legislation, it's kicking it down the can down the road again to 27, 28, and we're not probably heading quite in the right direction either. So kicking it down the road, plus the outcome's not going to be enough. We're going to have to, amend it in a few years' time, whereas what's happening in the UK is currently working and is working now. So what are we doing? So there's going to be a really strong debate on this, and thank you for all your input. I'll ask, there is another question here, and then I'll ask you one about Mule accounts as well, because they're quite interesting. I'll ask this question that we have here. Have our big 4 banks and the disproportionate influence they exercise over the major parties, has this been responsible for the sluggish response to this crisis, do you think? Have you got an opinion on that? I mean, you may not know.
Oh, look, I don't know. I think the banks have been very strong in echoing the Assistant Treasurer's comments about the Honeypot, which, I've already told you my views on that. As well, we often hear in the media or in discussions moral hazard being used a lot. And what that means is if banks reimburse their customers, then the customers will just be careless and lazy. And again, we come from a place of being very much informed by what we see on our frontline services. We operate the National Debt Helpline. We run a free consumer legal advice service as well, and we work with our colleagues from across the country. Nothing could be further from the truth. People are not careless with their life savings. They're a scam transaction is sometimes paying a house deposit, paying, which people are double and triple checking, but a hacker has got in and tinkered with an email. How on earth is anyone supposed to know that? We've heard of other cases where people click on a website which you could not tell it's a spitting image of a legitimate major bank or brand website. Again, really, really complex scams. And we don't have the information to be able to take care ourselves. So I think there's a little bit of just pushing away from a more of a bottom line perspective than
Yeah.
anything else, and trying to just minimize the amounts that the banks are going to be up for and investing.
And there's also just have a explain to us about caps, the caps of the reimbursement as well, and how that plays into this whole moral hazard argument as well.
Yeah, sure. So in the UK, there are caps on the amount that can be reimbursed. It used to be £415,000. What we recently, with the change in election, one of the first changes that the government made was to reduce that cap down to £65,000, which is a huge difference. Some of what I've read about that and heard about that is that that still covers 99% of scams. So perhaps that's part of the policy decision by the new government coming in. But again, £65,000 or whatever that translates into, like nearly 200,000 here, that's a huge difference from zero.
Yeah.
And all the money that people as well, it costs scams victims even more because all of a sudden they're in overdraft, they're defaulting on loans. There can be people, so many awful stories and so varied, but people taking out loans to pay for a scam recovery company, which is a second scam on top. Just it's so that again, the harms could be prevented even if there were a cap in place. There's also a small fee and similarly, there's a little fee in the e-payments code too, but there's a small fee that scams victims pay in the UK as well. So there are all these measures you can put in place around it. Sometimes you can't get all of those adjustments into a soundbite in the media, but there are ways and there are protections that we can put in place to make Australia the best model for scams protection.
Fantastic. We've got time for just a couple more questions, but I've got one here. Do you think there should be three-factor authentication?
Have
you ever heard of that?
I'm not sure. Is the third the face? I'm not sure.
I'm not
Might
sure
need
either.
more
But
info.
what about two-factor? But also, I guess the identification of the accounts as well, ensuring that happens, because it does seem quite strange that you can just nominate an account. I always worry I'm going to get the number wrong and that it's going to go to the wrong account.
So that work is underway. The banks have agreed to a scam safe accord. It's not fully coming online until the end of next year, though. So the confirmation of pay, maybe the major banks might announce it sooner, I'm hearing, but ultimately we still don't have those checks in place. Any authentication and checks, I know they can be painful, but in the absence of banks, telcos, and platforms investing and protecting their customers, we're going to have to go through this pain, which isn't really fair. So, but anyway, so I think if third factor authentication exists, then until we get better laws and protections in place, you're going to be on the hook for the losses. So yes, I think we should have it. People would choose to have it.
Well, interestingly, you were talking earlier in our chat about frictions. The banks are really pushing back against these types of measures to, safety measures. They're saying, oh, there's too much friction, our customers will be up in arms. And so banks really pushing back against it as well. But potentially, if there is that change in balance where the banks are having to wear some of the cost of this, that they will be more likely to bring these in and protect their customers. And people don't want to lose their life savings, do they? And it is potentially slightly frustrating in some ways, but because of these massive losses that we can incur, it'll be interesting to see what happens with this new legislation as well.
Look, I think that's really important. And I think, while we've got banks, telcos, and digital platforms going first, the fast followers in the assistant treasurer's terms are superannuation and crypto. And we've got, I think it's now $4 trillion sitting in superannuation,
Yes.
with, perhaps, I would say if third factor authentication exists, then it should definitely be over the superannuation funds. Absolutely. So yeah.
I might now, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there wondering how on earth they can protect themselves. So I'll just mention here that the federal government has set up Scam Watch, so you can type in Scam Watch into your search engine and just have a look at how you can protect yourself. But there's also for small business, there's a program called Cyber Wardens. As I mentioned right at the start, small business are often targeted. It's because you don't have those big departments that are putting in place your protections. So it's a really good idea to get on board and do a cyber wardens course. There are ways that you can protect yourselves, and we have more details on our website as well. But you also have on the Consumer Action Law Centre has some supports on your website as well. Or what do you recommend people should be doing to protect themselves?
Yeah, sure. So can we send around a link afterwards?
Yeah, yeah, we'll
Interested.
see.
Yeah, great. Well, if you're interested in this debate and the debate around the protections, we've just made on behalf of and together with our consumer advocate colleagues, a submission to Treasury's consultation. So I can send that around. We're firmly of the view that banks should be protecting their customers, and therefore we don't have tips on how to on our website. But if someone does, just exercise extreme caution is what I would say with everything with your money until we get some protections in place. But if people do fall victim to a scam, the first thing you should do is call your bank and try to just shut it down and get that money back. But ID Care is an agency that provides help with recovering from a scam. So they can link you in with all the supports that you might need and help you to make a report to the National Anti-Scam Centre, which Scamwatch is part of. Which can help prevent other scams, further people falling victim to a similar scam. But also they can help you with repairing your ID if it has been compromised, because I think every single one of us has been part of a data breach, whether we know it or not, unfortunately. So the information is all out there. And again, without protections, scammers are able to just use that information and access our money. So got to be very, very careful. But ID Care can help with that, all of that side of things as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's a huge help because often people don't know where to turn and it's just devastating. Who do you talk to? You can't, you're ringing up somebody at the bank and we'll touch, very last thing, I think we'll just touch on these Mule accounts. They're an interesting thing. Mule accounts, sort of fake accounts. What are they and what has the UK done? Because I think I heard that the number in the UK is really decreased since they've brought in these changes. Are you able to explain what they are?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think the UK example the UK experience is yet another example of why putting a business on the hook for reimbursing the scam losses drives the incentive to stop the scams in the first place. And that's why we've seen the reduction, because sending banks and receiving banks, so the money that the money is transferred into, they're equally liable to reimburse 50-50 the scam loss over in the UK. So they've seen the reduction. So they've seen banks placing far more scrutiny on opening up new bank accounts, on checking bank accounts with suspicious activity, monitoring them, and shutting them down when they need to. Previously, that wasn't happening because they weren't on the hook. And in Australia, they're not on the hook. You can't even go to AFCA about a receiving bank or a Mule account. But it's not just the setting up of bank accounts. So I'll just step back a little bit. So yes, again, the Mule account is the account, not your own account, but the account you transfer money into. And the scammer has some level of control over that account, whether it's their own account or whether it's someone working for them or whether they have control of it and they can whisk money out of that account and off into crypto or the ether or whatever it is. So that's what a Mule account is. And we're hearing of scammers setting up Mule accounts. I've even heard of because Australia is a honeypot, I've heard of people traveling to Australia to set up Mule accounts because it's so easy to do so, because there's no pressure and rules and scrutiny on the banks, and then using that to siphon the scam money through. There's also a phenomenon of, and there's been some campaigns around this, some advertising campaigns, but people like international students who might then go home and not need their, or dormant accounts, not need that account, being tricked into handing over the details or being paid to hand over the details of that account. They've gone, and then a scammer has use of an active account and can get away with washing money through until a bank looks into it and shuts it down. But that's not happening. And we've even heard stories of scammers who are operating those accounts challenging if a bank recovers that money and sends it back to the sending account, or freezes the amount. We've heard of the scammer taking complaints to AFCA, to the Financial Complaints Authority, to try and being paid that money back. It's very complicated and hard to prove. But again, like we're such as consumers, we're so powerless in this, and we have no access to information yet. Again, what we're expected to do now, and more so in the future under these future laws, unless they change, is somehow access this information that we don't have access to and prove our entitlement to a claim in a system stacked against it.
Yeah. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much. It's been really, really enlightening, and it is an incredibly important issue. And I think this is coming up. It's going to be debated in the coming months. I think it's really important we get this right, and we get it right now rather than in 2028 when we realise it's possibly failed. So I'll be working hard with people like you to make sure that we get the amendments that we need. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it in the middle of the day, and we know you're working you're really busy doing all this incredible work. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you do protecting consumers. And we really appreciate hearing all your opinions today. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll see you again. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We will put some links we'll send you the links is what we're going to do. And we'll also do a post on this and send some information out. But please get in touch if you want some more information about what we're going to be doing about preventing scams, and for those victims of scams, how they're going to be hopefully reimbursed in the future, what we can do to act on their behalf. Thanks, everyone. See you later.